Chapter 1. The Crack in a Seemingly Peaceful Home. I never thought the cruelest wound would come from inside my own home. At 66, I was shoved to the floor by my daughter-in-law, her baby pressed to her chest as she looked down at me and spat one word, filthy. My husband ran to steady me, but my son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love, stood in the doorway, silent, as if my humiliation was something ordinary. In that instant, the walls of my house felt colder than ever, and I realized I had opened my door to love only to be erased inside it. What she never imagined was that truth has a way of leaving footprints, and every cruel act was already being recorded, waiting for the day justice would finally speak. I was 66 years old when I realized my own house no longer felt like mine. Walter and I had spent our retirement years quietly in the home my Aunt Clara left me, a modest but warm two-story place in the heart of Austin, Texas. The garden out back had been my pride, a place filled with roses and hydrangeas, and the front porch still carried the faint scent of my aunt's favorite jasmine. For years it had been a sanctuary, a reminder of family roots and the stability I thought would last the rest of my life. When Daniel asked if he and his new wife could move in back in 2015, Walter and I agreed without hesitation. He was our only child, 35 now, but at the time still trying to find steady footing after college and a string of jobs that never seemed to stick. Vanessa was 24, then smiling polite, saying all the right things about how grateful she was. They were young and struggling, and the idea of them saving money while living with us felt right. Family helps family. That was what I told Walter as we cleared space in the house. At first it was manageable. They occupied one of the upstairs bedrooms while Walter and I carried on as usual. I cooked dinners, Vanessa sometimes helped clean, and Daniel promised he was looking for better opportunities. But slowly, almost without my noticing, the rhythm of the house changed. Vanessa began suggesting how furniture might be arranged differently to make the rooms feel more modern. The first time she moved our dining chairs into the living room, she laughed and said it was temporary. Weeks later, they were still there. The master bedroom downstairs had always belonged to Walter and me. My knees ached too much for the stairs, and I liked being close to the kitchen and garden. One afternoon, Vanessa told me climbing the stairs was hard with a newborn on the way. She said it would make sense for her and Daniel to take the master so the baby could have easy access to everything on one level. Walter looked at me with uncertainty, but Daniel nodded in agreement, already convinced. Before I could gather my words, they were moving their clothes into our room. Walter and I carried our things upstairs that evening without argument. Little by little, Vanessa's presence pressed into every corner. She took over the kitchen, saying my meals were too heavy and not nutritionally balanced. She replaced the pots I had used for decades with shiny new ones she ordered online. I found myself drifting out of the room, more often telling myself it was easier to let her cook. The living room changed too. My chair, the one where I read every morning, was pushed into a corner. She said it blocked the flow of the space. I watched Walter sit on the edge of the couch instead, looking small in his own home. The remarks started subtle. She would wrinkle her nose when I brought flowers inside, muttering about allergies. She rolled her eyes when I hummed hymns while cleaning. Daniel rarely corrected her. He would shrug and say she was tired, that new marriages were stressful. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe this was only temporary, that they would save enough money and find their own place. The years passed quickly. 8 of them blurred together, marked by small humiliations I swallowed one by one. When Mason was born, I thought things would change. I thought being a grandmother would soften Vanessa's edges. Instead, the arrival of that little boy gave her more power. Every noise became a threat to his sleep, every visit from neighbors, an intrusion, every gesture from me, a risk to his health. That Tuesday morning should have been like any other. I had risen early, humming softly, as I arranged fresh roses from my garden in a glass vase. The petals were still cool with dew, their scent bright against the warm kitchen air. Walter sat in his chair by the window reading the newspaper, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked peaceful the way he always did in the mornings. I carried the vase into the living room, wanting to brighten the space. Mason's cries pierced the air, sharp and demanding. Vanessa's voice followed, irritated and sharp. "Eleanor, can you keep it down in there? The baby needs his rest." I froze for a moment, confused. I had barely made a sound besides the soft clink of dishes. Still, I moved carefully, cradling the vase in my arms. As I stepped into the living room, Vanessa turned. Her eyes were hard, her posture rigid. Mason was in her arms, his face red from crying. I opened my mouth to ask if she needed help, but before the words left my lips, she moved toward me. her hand shoved hard against my shoulder. The vase slipped from my hands and crashed against the hardwood floor. Water and petals scattered around me as my knees buckled. Filthy. The words spat from her lips, thick with disgust. Don't you dare touch him. I sat stunned on the floor, the water seeping into my skirt, roses crushed under my palms. My chest tightened as humiliation spread through me like fire. Walter dropped his paper and rushed forward, his face pale. He knelt beside me, his hand on my arm, steadying me as if I were breakable glass. Daniel stood in the doorway. He had seen everything I could tell from the way his face shifted, not shocked but weary, as if this was nothing new. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, and said nothing. In that silence, in that moment where even my own son chose not to speak, I felt the truth settle deep in my bones. This was no longer my home. I had opened the door out of love, and now I was a stranger inside it. I let Walter help me to my feet, my hands trembling. The roses lay scattered, their petals torn and bruised. Vanessa stood tall, clutching Mason as though I were a threat, her lips curled in satisfaction. I turned my eyes away before she could see the tears forming, before she could know how much she had broken me. And in that heavy silence, the house I once called safe felt colder than it ever had before. Chapter 2. Silent Wounds Accumulating. I knelt and pressed a dish towel into the puddle until the water stopped spreading, then gathered broken glass and petals with my hands cupped like a small shovel. Walter steadied me when I stood, his palm warm at my elbow. He asked if I was hurt. I said I was fine and thanked him. The lie tasted metallic in my mouth. I rinsed the roses that could be saved and set them in a smaller vase by the kitchen sink. The house hummed with the sound machine from the nursery and the faint clatter of dishes as Vanessa moved through the living room. Daniel disappeared down the hall. No one mentioned the word filthy. After lunch, I went outside to the garden and clipped the browned heads from the hydrangeas. The sun sat high over the pecan tree, and the heat lifted the soil's smell into the air. I pulled on my gloves and worked the beds the way my aunt taught me, patient and careful small motions, repeated until they changed the shape of things. That was how the house had been taken from me. Not with a fight, not with a door slammed once and for all, but with small changes that settled into place until they felt permanent. In the first year, Daniel and Vanessa were my guests. I cooked chicken and rice on Sundays, and we ate in the dining room with the curtains open. Vanessa called my recipes hearty. By the second year, hearty had become heavy, and she offered to make dinner so the meals would be, in her words, better for everyone. I said yes to be kind, and then I said yes again because saying no would have sounded mean. My cast iron pan went to the back of the cabinet. New pans arrived in boxes with a smiling truck printed on them. The boxes kept arriving. By the third year, the living room did not look like mine. The armchair I used to read in had been angled toward the wall because Vanessa said the flow felt blocked. She bought a beige rug that shed small fibers and called the color sand. She removed the family photos from the hallway and said the frames made the space too busy. I found the frames stacked in a plastic bin in the garage with a piece of masking tape that said, Emaisk. When Mason arrived, Vanessa wrote house rules on the whiteboard on the refrigerator. Quiet hours in the morning, no vacuuming during nap blocks, air purifier on at all times, no visitors without clearing 24 hours in advance, laundry for baby clothing separate with special detergent only, no scented candles, no bleach, no kitchen sponge on the counter. In red at the bottom, she had written germ safe equals baby safe. I stared at the list and felt my shoulders round forward a little more. Daniel stood at the fridge that week with his hand on the handle and told me that newborns were fragile. He said that the pediatrician had stressed caution. He said Vanessa was learning everything she could. He said she was under stress and needed us to be patient. I asked if I could hold Mason after dinner. He said maybe tomorrow, depending on the schedule. The schedule became a person in our home. It announced when the blinds stayed closed and when they could be opened a few inches. It decided where fresh flowers were allowed. It made the television off limits after 8 in the evening. Walter turned the volume down lower and lower until captions became habit. He told me he did not mind. He told me he was getting used to the quiet. I nodded and pretended I was too. There were good moments, and I clung to them as proof that I was not losing my mind. On clear afternoons, Walter and I sat on the back steps and passed a thermos of tea between us. We watched a lizard warm itself on the stone path. We talked about the farmer's market at Muller and whether the peaches would be sweet this year. Sometimes I heard Mason laughing in the hallway and caught a glimpse of his fists opening and closing, and for a heartbeat I believed that love would be enough to make the house belong to all of us again. But the edge of every day stayed sharp. Vanessa would say that the dishwasher had to be loaded in a very specific way. She would say that I used too much dish soap. She would say that the hand towel on the oven door was a hazard. When I hummed while wiping the counter, she would pause and tilt her head, and I would stop without being asked. Daniel said she was tired. He said she was not herself. He said I was reading into things. He said postpartum stress can last longer than people think. He said we needed to be a team. On a Saturday in late spring, my cousin Susan Harper stopped by with a pie from a bakery on South Congress. She looked rested and cheerful the way people look when they are on their way to meet friends. She sat at the kitchen table and told me she had run into Vanessa at church. Susan said Vanessa had so much on her plate. She said the younger generation had fresh ideas about how to run a household. She said I should consider letting them take the lead in the day-to-day. She said I had earned the right to rest. She smiled when she said it as if she were offering me a gift. The words settled on my chest like dust on a forgotten shelf. After Susan left, I wiped the table until it squeaked under my cloth. I told myself she meant well. I told myself that church friends do not know the truth of a house. I looked at the whiteboard on the refrigerator. Quiet hours had been expanded. A new line had appeared that read no kitchen entry during morning nap unless necessary. I tried to picture what necessary looked like. The bills used to come in a neat stack on the first week of every month. I have always liked order, so I would sit with my checkbook and a cup of tea and line everything up. Austin Energy, Texas Gas Service, water, internet. Walter would read the paper and ask if I needed a stamp. I would hand him the envelopes, and he would walk them to the mailbox. We had done it that way since the year we married. I noticed the change on an ordinary afternoon when the mail sat unopened in a pile by the microwave. Vanessa had brought it in and left it there while she sterilized baby bottles. I moved the envelopes into a stack, and something about the thin blue of the Austin Energy bill caught my eye. The font looked the same, the logo was the same, but the name printed in bold on the top right corner was not mine. It was Vanessa Carter Hayes. I stood very still, my thumb pressed against the edge of the paper until it left a pale crescent in my skin. I pulled the Texas Gas Service envelope and slid the bill free. The same name. My heart tapped once and then again harder. The water bill. The same. My own name appeared in the address line because the house was still mine, but the account names were not Eleanor Hayes. I placed the bills side by side on the counter and felt the kitchen tilt. The sound machine in the nursery hummed distant and steady. The refrigerator kicked on and rattled briefly before settling. I told myself to breathe and think. There could be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Vanessa had set up autopay because she thought it would make things easier. Perhaps the utility companies had mixed the fields when an address update went through. My mind did the simple math of hope. Then I picked up the phone and called Daniel. He was in the driveway, he said, getting Mason's stroller out of the trunk. I asked him if he knew why the utility bills were in Vanessa's name. He paused long enough for me to hear the tiny click of realization. He said Vanessa handles the household logistics now and that I should not worry. I asked him when that changed. He said it had been gradual. He said after Mason was born, Vanessa took on more to ease the load. He said I should let them do this because they live here full-time and that it made sense. I told him that I also live here full-time. He said he understood and thanked me for being flexible. He added that Vanessa was doing the best she could under difficult circumstances and that I should not take it personally. The words felt like a door closing softly. I set the phone down and picked up the bills again. The paper felt slick under my fingertips. I read the due dates and the usage charts like I always did. The numbers looked ordinary. Nothing in the columns revealed intent. Only the name did. I carried the stack to the dining table and laid them out in a row as if they were puzzle pieces. Walter sat across from me and adjusted his glasses. He read them once, then again, his brow folding deeper. He asked me if I had authorized any changes. I shook my head. He asked me if Vanessa had asked permission. I shook my head again. In the evening, I tried to set the bills back on the counter without anyone noticing. Vanessa came in to fill a cup at the sink and glanced at the envelopes. She said that the companies had been impossible to deal with lately, that sometimes it was easier to consolidate under one name, that she could explain everything later. She was cheerful and brisk. She smiled without showing teeth. I could not find my voice. I nodded as if something simple had been clarified. When she left the room, I felt my pulse in my palms. I put the bills in a folder and slid it into the top drawer of the buffet where Aunt Clara used to keep her recipe cards. I told myself to wait to pay attention to collect facts instead of feelings. I wiped the counter a final time and turned off the kitchen light. The house exhaled and settled around us. Somewhere down the hall, Mason stirred and gave a small cry, then went quiet again. I stood in the darkness and tried to remember what it felt like to trust the ground under my feet. Chapter 3. The curtain pulled back. I woke before sunrise and lay still until the ceiling softened from gray to a tired blue. Walter breathed evenly beside me. The house had that early hour quiet that makes every small sound feel like a decision. I slipped from bed, pulled on a sweater, and went down the stairs to make coffee. The kitchen light felt harsh, so I left it off and let the window give me enough to see the kettle and the tin of grounds. The familiarity steadied me. I poured a mug for Walter and one for myself and waited for the sound machine at the end of the hall to cycle down. When it did, I carried the bills I had tucked into the buffet drawer back to the table. I told myself I would check our insurance policy to see if any notice had gone out that might explain the name changes. The basement door stuck like it always does in wet weather. I pressed my shoulder against it, and it gave with a sigh. The air down there had the cool of concrete and the faint smell of cardboard and lemon cleaner. Walter had built simple wooden shelves when we moved in, and I had labeled boxes in my careful hand. Winter linens, holiday dishes, taxes, insurance. The box I wanted sat on the top shelf in the back. I stood on the first stair and reached. Dust rose in a thin veil when I pulled it down. I carried it to the workbench and lifted the lid. Inside were the things that mark a life without anyone noticing. Old auto policies, a folder with roofing estimates from the year hail took our gutters. The homeowner policy thick and stapled at the corner. Underneath it, a manila envelope with our house address written on the tab. I slid the contents out. Utility statements that did not belong to me spilled across the bench. Austin Energy again, Texas Gas Service again, City Water again. Each one printed with the same bold name, Vanessa Carter Hayes. The stack was months deep. At the bottom, folded once, was a form from the United States Postal Service. I knew the shape of it because I had filled one out when Daniel went off to college. This one listed our address. The forwarding field was filled with her name first. My heart seemed to pause between beats. Someone had changed how our mail arrived before I ever opened the door to the box. Someone had made the world tilt toward them without a sound. Walter called down to ask if I needed a hand. I told him I was fine. My voice sounded steady, so I believed it for a second. Then my hands began to shake. I pressed my fingers flat on the workbench and stared at the forms until the letters blurred. I thought of the whiteboard on our fridge and the rules written in red. Quiet hours, no scented candles, no kitchen entry during morning nap unless necessary. I thought of my chair pressed into a corner, of the rug she called sand, of Daniel saying I should be patient. It all lined up like a set of dominoes that had been waiting for a hidden hand. I carried the bills up the stairs one careful step at a time. Walter met me in the kitchen. I set the stack on the table and pointed to the names. He put on his glasses and read slowly. He read again. His mouth tightened into a line I had not seen since the year his mother died. He asked how long I thought this had been going on. I told him I did not know. I told him I planned to find out. I told him the forwarding form had a date I did not want to say out loud. He reached for my hand and I let him take it. I tried to be calm and rational because that is who I am, but grief rose in me like a tide. Not the kind that makes you wail, the kind that hollows you quietly. I stepped into the laundry room and closed the door. I pressed a towel to my face to keep the sound from leaving the walls. I stood that way until the rush passed and left me empty. Around mid-morning, I walked out to the front yard. The sun had climbed enough to pull shadows under the oak, and Linda Torres was clipping basil along the fence. She is a retired nurse with a practical kindness that has comforted me more than once. She looked up and asked if I was all right. I told her I had tripped on a rug yesterday. That was the only piece of the truth I could manage in the moment. She frowned in a way that said she did not believe me. She said she had noticed raised voices the afternoon before, and that her outdoor camera had picked up movement at our front walkway several times this month. She said if there was anything I needed to see, she could pull the files, and I could decide what to do with them. She reminded me she had worked trauma, and that sometimes you need to see a thing plainly to understand what it is. I asked if the camera faced our porch. She nodded and said it did, and also captured a strip of our front window if the blinds were open. She said there had been incidents where Vanessa moved past me in a way that did not look accidental. She said it looked like shoving. She said she had heard words no daughter-in-law should use. She told me she had saved the files because she worried and she had not wanted to embarrass me if she was wrong. I felt both exposed and seen. I thanked her and said I might need her help. She said to knock any time. Back inside, I made tea and set the cups on the counter because the table felt dangerous with those bills still lined up like a verdict. Vanessa came in with Mason on her hip. She said the pediatrician wanted a stricter nap schedule. She said the humidity was terrible for the baby's breathing. She said we should keep the air purifier at a higher setting. She moved through the kitchen as if she had always owned it, as if the cupboard doors were built to open under her hands. Daniel came in behind her with his keys in his fist. He said he had a phone interview in an hour and needed quiet. He kissed Mason's head and told me he would check in later. I told Vanessa I had found some mail and a few account matters that looked odd. I kept my voice like the smooth edge of a table. I said I would appreciate an explanation about the names on the bills and the forwarding notice. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a nap. She said that had to be a simple mistake. She said she had spent hours on hold consolidating payments to make life easier. She said the postal service was confusing and sometimes their online form autofills the wrong way. She smiled as she said it, as if we were allies solving an annoyance together. I told her the forwarding form put her name first, and that is not an autofill problem. Her eyes held mine for a beat patient and flat, then she dropped them to Mason and bobbed him gently. She said I should not stress myself. She said stress was bad for my blood pressure. She said she would call the companies and get everything switched back. She added that new mothers have to take on a lot and that everyone appreciated my flexibility. The word flexibility landed like a weight on my chest. Walter stepped to the threshold and asked if he could help with the calls. Vanessa said there was no need. She said she had it handled. She kept her voice warm, but there was a tiny curl at the edge of her mouth like a ribbon being cut cleanly. Daniel returned to the doorway and asked if things were good because he needed a quiet hour. Vanessa told him everything was handled. He nodded and walked down the hall. I gathered the bills and the postal form and placed them in a folder. I said that since it involved accounts tied to the house, I would keep these in the buffet with the other documents. She said that was fine. She did not look at the papers as I spoke. She kept her eyes on Mason and on a point far past my shoulder. Walter's fingers rested against the doorframe like he needed to feel the house to remember it was real. The afternoon stretched. I watered the garden and tried to sort my thoughts into something like order. I thought about Linda's camera and about the way Vanessa's hand had felt on my shoulder when she pushed me. I thought about Daniel's quiet compliance and the date on the forwarding form. I thought about Aunt Clara and how she used to say that truth is not loud, but it is steady. It keeps showing up until you finally attend to it. I decided to confront Vanessa again without softening the edges. I set the folder on the coffee table in the living room. The beige rug looked like dry beach sand in the late light. Vanessa sat on the couch with Mason sleeping against her chest. I said that the names on the utilities and the forwarding of mail had to be corrected immediately. I said I expected it to be done within the week. I said I wanted written confirmation. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. She stared at me with a face I could not read for a moment. Then she lifted her hand in a small shrug. She said it was just a mistake. She said she would fix it. Her tone suggested she was humoring a neighbor not speaking to the woman who owned the deed. Her eyes did not match her voice. They were calm, in the way of a person who has already decided the outcome and is only performing the motions. It was a look I had seen on a surgeon the day he told my mother she would not recover. Not cruel, not kind. Final. I picked up the folder and turned away so she would not see the flush in my cheeks. In the kitchen, I placed the papers back into the drawer beneath Aunt Clara's recipe cards. Walter stood there with his tea cooling in his hand. He asked if we were settled. I said she called it a mistake. He said he did not believe her. I said I did not either. We stood there for a long time, listening to the house breathe, and the quiet felt like the pause between a match striking and the flame catching. Chapter 4. A Plan in the Shadows. I woke early the next morning and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. Walter had gone out to the garden, leaving me alone with the silence that seemed to grow heavier every day. The folder with the bills and the forwarding form lay in the drawer only a few feet away, its weight pressing on me even through the wood. I knew I could not ignore it any longer. I needed someone who could tell me where I stood. I remembered Robert Klein, the attorney who had handled my Aunt Clara's estate when she passed. He had been kind but firm a man with steady eyes and a patient way of explaining things. I had not spoken to him in years, but I still had his card tucked into the back of my address book. I dialed his office and left a message. An hour later, his secretary called back and told me he could see me that afternoon. I told Walter I had errands and drove across town with the folder on the passenger seat. The streets of Austin buzzed with weekday traffic, cyclists weaving through lanes, food trucks already parked near office buildings. I parked in the shade of a live oak and walked into the modest brick building where Robert's office occupied the second floor. He looked older, silver hair sweeping back from his forehead, but his handshake was as firm as ever. He gestured me to sit and asked how I was holding up. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my voice steady. I told him I had questions about my aunt's will and needed to confirm details. He pulled a file from his cabinet, thick and neatly tabbed, and set it on the desk between us. He flipped to the section that mattered most. Aunt Clara had left the house entirely to me. The current market estimate was around $750,000, though he said with Austin prices it could easily appraise higher now. More importantly, there was a clause she had insisted on, one he rarely saw. Any attempt to alter ownership through fraud, coercion, or deception would void the rights of the offending party permanently. He looked up at me and said my aunt must have known the value of foresight. I felt a swell of gratitude for a woman who had been gone for years but was still protecting me. I told him about the utility bills, the forwarding form, the feeling of being pushed out of my own home. He listened without interrupting, only nodding and taking a few notes. When I finished, he told me calmly that the will gave me strong standing, but that I would need clear evidence of fraudulent intent before taking legal steps. He recommended I speak to the county prosecutor's office about elder abuse concerns, as overlapping issues often strengthened a case. When I left his office, I sat in my car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel until the leather grew warm under my palms. I felt both relief and fear. Relief that the house was truly mine and that Clara had protected me, fear that Vanessa might already be moving faster than I realized. That evening, after Walter had gone to bed, I called the Travis County District Attorney's office and asked to speak to someone about elder abuse. The woman who returned my call was Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morales. Her voice carried the sharpness of someone who had heard too many stories like mine. She agreed to meet me the next day. We sat in a small office with beige walls and a framed certificate behind her desk. Rachel was younger than I expected, maybe 42, with dark hair pulled into a braid and a stare that did not waver. She asked me to start from the beginning. I told her everything from the slow changes to the shove in the living room to the names on the bills to Linda's mention of her camera. I showed her the forwarding form and watched her jaw tighten. She told me plainly that what I described fit patterns of coercion she had prosecuted before. She said elder abuse was not only physical harm, but also financial manipulation and control of environment. She advised me not to confront Vanessa again until I had more evidence. She said if I could gather recordings, documents, or witness statements, the case would be stronger and less likely to fall apart under a defense attorney's pressure. I asked her what would happen if Vanessa tried to force a transfer of the deed. She told me any attempt would need my signature, and if they tried to forge it, that would be a separate crime. Her eyes softened just slightly then. She said it was hard when the abuser was family, that the betrayal cut deeper, but that the law was there if I was willing to trust it. I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. That night I could not sleep. I walked the halls in the dark, listening to the hum of the air purifier, the click of the refrigerator, the faint whimper of Mason through the baby monitor. I drifted into the study, a room Vanessa rarely entered. I opened drawers one by one, looking for the insurance folder I thought might hold more records. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of expired coupons and an old phone book, I found a thin file I had never seen before. Inside was a single sheet. A draft deed transfer form. My eyes traced the lines once, then again slower. The handwriting was unmistakable. Vanessa's sharp, slanting letters filled in my name, Walters and Daniels. Notes were scribbled in the margins, estimates of property taxes, questions about appraisal values. At the bottom in darker ink was the date from only a week ago. I sank into the desk chair, the paper trembling between my fingers. This was no mistake or confusion. This was intent, clear as any confession. My stomach turned cold, and I pressed the form flat on the desk, as if holding it steady could make the world stop spinning. Walter called from upstairs, asking if I was all right. I forced my voice steady and said I was coming to bed. I slid the form into the folder with the bills and the forwarding notice. I closed the drawer slowly, as if making any sound might give me away. When I lay down beside Walter, I felt the weight of the folder pressing through the walls of the house itself. Vanessa had moved past testing boundaries. She was preparing to take everything. The quiet of the room wrapped around me, thick and uneasy, and I knew the time for pretending had ended. Chapter 5. The Family Line, Torn Apart. I waited until Daniel was alone in the garage, sorting through a pile of tools that had gathered dust. The draft deed transfer form felt heavy in my hand as I stepped into the dim light. He glanced up surprised, then smiled weakly as if the sight of me there unsettled him. I asked him straight if he knew anything about this paper, holding it out so there could be no mistake. He read it once and his face drained of color. He swore he had never seen it before. He said he would never sign something like that, not against me, not against his father. I searched his eyes for the boy I had raised, the one who used to bring me daisies from the schoolyard, but all I saw was a man cornered carrying secrets in the folds of his silence. I told him that Vanessa's handwriting was all over the margins, that the numbers and notes were hers, not mine, not his. He rubbed his forehead and said she must have been looking into possibilities, trying to plan ahead, trying to be practical. His voice wavered and I felt the sting of doubt settle deeper. I asked if he was part of this scheme. He shook his head hard. He swore again. But I remembered the bills in her name, the mail forwarding the way he had stood in the doorway when she shoved me, and said nothing. His denial did not ease me. It made me ache. That evening at dinner, Vanessa set the table with a smile that never reached her eyes. She ladled soup into bowls and commented on the weather, on Mason's new toy, on Daniel's job applications. Then, as she placed bread on the table, she said calmly that maybe Walter and I needed more supervision. She mentioned adult protective services as if it were a neighbor she had chatted with over coffee. She said neglect could be subtle, that sometimes older people could not keep up with the demands of their own care. I froze with the spoon halfway to my lips. Walter stiffened across from me. Daniel's face paled, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Vanessa's tone was smooth, but her eyes locked on me, daring me to react. I set the spoon down and asked her directly if she was threatening us. She laughed softly and said she was only concerned that she wanted to make sure everyone was safe. She reminded me of the stumble I had taken when she shoved me, twisting it into evidence of frailty. She said if the wrong people believed I could not manage my affairs, decisions might have to be made for my own good. The way she said it told me she knew exactly what she was doing. Later that night, Walter sat on the edge of our bed with his hands folded tight. He asked how much more we could endure. I told him that Rachel Morales at the prosecutor's office had warned me to gather evidence. I told him that now we had no choice. The next day, I overheard an argument through the thin wall of the hallway. Vanessa's voice was sharp, Daniel's was low and pleading. She said the credit cards were bleeding interest, that they were $85,000 in debt, that if he loved her, he would find a way to fix it. She said the simplest path was to apply for a loan using my name and Walter's. She said we would never notice if payments were made on time. Daniel protested, his words tumbling fast, saying it was wrong, saying he could not do that. She cut him off, telling him he owed her, telling him she had carried this family while he stumbled. I stood there in the hallway with my back pressed to the wall, my heart pounding so hard I feared they might hear it. When the voices quieted, I slipped outside into the yard and let the sun strike my face until the heat burned away the tremor in my hands. That afternoon, Linda Torres came over with a thumb drive in her hand. She said she had been thinking about what she told me the other day and decided I needed to see for myself. We sat at her kitchen table, the scent of basil strong from the plants on her windowsill, and she plugged the drive into her laptop. The screen showed grainy footage from her front camera. The angle caught the edge of our porch, the open blinds of our living room. The first clip showed Vanessa brushing past me with a shove hard enough that I stumbled. The sound picked up faintly enough to hear her call me useless. Another clip showed her standing on the porch with Mason in his stroller, speaking on the phone. Her words were clear. She said she would have the house soon, that it was only a matter of paperwork, that Eleanor was too old to fight it. She laughed at the end, sharp and cold. I pressed my hand to my mouth as the screen went black. Linda put her hand on mine and told me to keep the drive, that she had copies saved. She said she had seen enough in her years as a nurse to know when someone was in danger. I thanked her, my voice catching, and told her she had done more for me than she knew. I walked back across the yard with the drive tight in my fist, the sun low and the cicadas beginning their evening chorus. Walter met me at the door and asked what I carried. I told him it was proof. He looked at me with a mix of fear and relief. That night I placed the drive beside the folder of bills and the deed transfer form. Together they felt like pieces of a puzzle no one could deny. I sat at the table long after Walter had gone to bed, staring at the neat row of evidence, feeling both the weight of betrayal and the faint spark of resolve. The air was thick and still, and in that pause I realized the fight had shifted. It was no longer about suspicion or doubt, it was about survival. Chapter 6. The Courtroom Battle. I drove downtown with the folder and the thumb drive in a tote bag beside me, the courthouse rising pale and heavy against the Texas sky. Walter sat in the passenger seat, his hand gripping the edge of the seat as if he could anchor me there. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had to be. The streets pulsed with morning traffic, people on their way to jobs and errands, but for me the day had only one purpose. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of paper and disinfectant. ADA Rachel Morales met us in the hallway, her braid tight against her shoulder, her eyes steady. She shook Walter's hand and guided us into a small conference room. She laid out the plan carefully. We would submit the bills, the forwarding notice, the draft deed transfer, Linda's video, and Harold Green's testimony. Green had admitted that Vanessa approached him, bribed him to use his old seal, and he was prepared to state it under oath. Rachel said the defense would fight hard, claiming Vanessa had tenant rights after 8 years, and that she had contributed to the property in ways that gave her leverage. Rachel reminded me not to react to their arguments. She said the truth would hold if I stayed calm. When we entered the courtroom, the benches were lined with neighbors and curious faces. I saw Pastor Mitchell in the second row, his Bible folded under his arm. I saw Susan Harper seated on Vanessa's side, her pearl earrings flashing under the fluorescent light. Daniel sat at the back, pale, his shoulders bent. He did not look at me. Vanessa's lawyer was a man named Carter Mills, slick hair and a polished gray suit. He spoke with a smile that carried no warmth. He argued that Vanessa and Daniel had lived in the home nearly a decade, that they had poured labor and care into it, that Vanessa had taken on responsibility for household bills when Eleanor could not keep up. He used the phrase sweat equity and said that equity gave her a rightful stake. He painted Vanessa as a caretaker, a woman protecting her child and her in-laws from decline. I wanted to rise and shout, but Rachel's hand brushed against mine, quieting me. She rose and countered with the will, the clause Aunt Clara had written, the documents showing my name alone. She reminded the court that paying bills with someone else's money does not buy ownership, that coercion and fraud do not become virtue with time. Then Susan took the stand. My cousin's voice was soft at first, then stronger, as she said I was no longer capable of managing affairs. She claimed I misplaced items, forgot conversations needed guidance for simple tasks. She said she feared I was being taken advantage of by my own paranoia. Her eyes flicked to me with something sharp, something that had lived between us since Clara's death. Clara had left the house to me, not her, and in that courtroom her resentment bloomed like a poisonous flower. The words struck me harder than I expected. I sat frozen, hearing Susan speak as if she were describing a stranger. My hands trembled in my lap. Walter leaned close and whispered that lies cannot stand against truth. Rachel rose again and questioned Susan until cracks appeared. Susan admitted she had not lived with me, admitted she had not visited, often admitted her information came largely from conversations with Vanessa. By the time she stepped down, the room hummed with unease. The defense pressed again, this time accusing me of neglect. They suggested I was frail, that Walter was frail, that Vanessa had stepped in to fill the gaps. My chest burned with humiliation. Then Rachel stood and asked the judge for permission to play a recording. She held up Linda's thumb drive. The screen flickered on. The grainy video filled the courtroom. Everyone watched as Vanessa shoved me in the doorway, her words captured faintly. Useless. Another clip showed her laughing on the porch, saying the house would be hers soon, that I was too old to fight. Her voice carried clearly enough that gasps rose from the benches. Rachel let the silence after the video stretch until even Vanessa's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Then she spoke, her tone sharp, saying this was not care, this was not equity, this was exploitation. She reminded the court that elder neglect was a crime, not a weapon to be wielded against the victim. I looked at Vanessa across the room. Her smile was gone, her jaw tight, her eyes narrowed at the screen as if she could will the images to vanish. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. Susan fidgeted her earrings, catching the light again, but without their earlier confidence. The judge called a recess. People stood and murmured the weight of what they had seen heavy in the air. Walter squeezed my shoulder. Rachel leaned close and told me we had shifted the ground. She said the fight was far from over, but the truth had cut through the lies. I stepped into the hallway and pressed my back against the cool wall. The noise of conversation buzzed around me, but inside me there was only a quiet resolve. For the first time, I felt the tide turning, not fully, not safely, but turning all the same. Chapter 7. The Verdict and the Final Fall. The final day of the hearing dawned with a restless sky, low clouds pushing over Austin, as if the weather itself carried judgment. Walter and I drove in silence, the courthouse steps crowded with people who had followed every word of the testimony. Rachel met us at the entrance, her file thick with evidence, her voice calm. She said today the ruling would come, and she believed the record spoke louder than any lawyer's spin. Inside, the air buzzed with expectation. Vanessa sat at the defense table, her shoulders squared, her lips pressed tight. Daniel sat apart from her, his head lowered, hands clasped so hard the knuckles blanched. Susan was nowhere in sight. Pastor Mitchell was again in the second row, his Bible unopened but resting in his hands. The judge entered, and the room stilled. Papers shuffled, then silence fell heavy. The verdict was read in a voice that seemed to echo from the paneled walls. Vanessa Carter Hayes was found guilty of fraud, forgery, and mail fraud. The judge explained the sentence with deliberate care. 2 years probation, mandatory community service, a permanent restriction from managing financial accounts not in her name. No prison time, but the weight of shame and the mark of conviction sealed into her record. I exhaled, the sound shaky, and felt Walter's hand find mine. Vanessa's face did not crack, but her eyes darted quickly toward Daniel, searching for him. He did not look up. When court adjourned, Daniel approached me in the hallway. His eyes were rimmed red. He said he had been blind, that he had let fear and debt twist him into silence. He said he could not stay married to someone who would tear apart his family. He told me he would be filing for divorce that week. He said Mason needed stability, and he would fight for custody. My throat ached as I listened. For the first time in years, I saw my son choosing right over easy. I placed my hand on his cheek the way I used to when he was a boy, and told him he still had time to rebuild. The news spread quickly through our community. That Sunday, Pastor Mitchell stood at the pulpit and spoke about greed and the ways it can rot love from the inside out. He spoke of dishonor, of how family should be a refuge, not a battlefield. He never said Vanessa's name, but the congregation knew. Heads nodded, eyes lowered, whispers spread. By the end of the week, the church groups that had once welcomed her with smiles no longer returned her calls. Neighbors avoided her at the market. Invitations stopped arriving. The circle she had once tried to control closed around her, not in support, but in quiet rejection. For me, the true closure came at home. I returned to the study where the old files were kept and opened the box marked Clara. Inside, tucked between recipe cards and faded letters, was an envelope I had never noticed. My aunt's handwriting flowed across the front. Inside, on a single sheet, she had written her warning. If anyone tries to steal this house trust, that the law will protect you. I sat down slowly, the letter trembling in my hands. My vision blurred as tears welled and spilled, dropping dark spots onto the paper. I heard Clara's voice in my memory, firm but loving, always telling me to stand tall. She had known. She had seen the possibility of betrayal and built her protection into the will like a shield. I gripped the letter tightly against my chest. For the first time in years, I felt truly guarded, as if Clara herself stood behind me. Walter came in quietly and rested his hand on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke. Words were unnecessary. The paper in my hands, the verdict fresh in my ears, the silence of the house finally ours again. I closed my eyes and let the weight of it all settle. The fear, the anger, the long months of doubt, all giving way to something steadier. The house was mine. My son was finding his way back. The community had seen the truth. And in that moment, with Clara's letter pressed close, I felt the walls of our home breathe with me again. Chapter 8. Justice, Revenge, and Peace. Spring came early that year, the air softer than usual, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt alive again. Walter was in the garden most mornings, trimming the rose bushes Aunt Clara had planted decades earlier. I would watch from the porch as he bent carefully, his hat tilted low against the sun, his hands steady. Mason toddled across the yard, chasing a rubber ball that always rolled faster than his little legs could carry him. His laughter rose over the hum of the street, and filled the spaces that had been silent too long. Inside, I rearranged the living room the way it had once been. My chair returned to its corner by the window. The family photos hung back in the hallway. The rug Vanessa bought, the one she called sand, was rolled up and left for the garbage truck. When I walked through the rooms now, I could breathe without feeling observed. The house seemed to exhale with me. Daniel stayed with us for several months after the divorce papers were filed. He found work again at an insurance company on the north side of town. Every Friday, he brought home groceries, setting them on the counter with a small smile, as if trying to repair with actions what had once been broken by silence. He paid for utilities and insisted on covering part of the property tax. Walter tried to refuse, but Daniel would not let him. Slowly, I began to see the boy I raised inside the man standing before me. By the end of summer, he bought a modest house only 10 minutes away. Close enough for Mason to visit, often close enough for me to drop by with a pie or a bag of fresh tomatoes from the garden. Mason's room there was painted light blue with shelves already waiting for books. Daniel said he wanted his son to grow up surrounded by stability, by roots, by the kind of home that was not just walls, but safety. As for Vanessa, she left Austin quietly. Some said she moved in with a cousin outside Houston, others that she rented a small apartment in Dallas. Wherever she went, her reputation had already traveled before her. Church friends no longer called. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Former co-workers remembered her name and shook their heads. The same community she had once manipulated now closed its doors. She carried the weight of her conviction with her, not in handcuffs, but in whispers and in the absence of trust. I never saw her again. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if she thought about the life she could have built had she chosen honesty over greed. But then Mason's giggle would echo down the hall as he dreamed in his sleep, or Walter's steady breathing would remind me that love endures longer than betrayal and the wondering past. One afternoon in late fall, I sat at the dining table with Aunt Clara's letter spread before me. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, the ink softening into the fibers. I traced her handwriting with my finger, each word carrying the strength of a woman who had understood more than I ever realized. If anyone tries to steal this house, trust that the law will protect you. She had believed in the system, and she had been right. Tears blurred my vision, but they were not heavy with sorrow. They carried relief, gratitude, and something stronger, the knowledge that I had survived. Revenge had not come in shouting matches or broken dishes. It had come in patience, in truth laid bare, in the steady work of gathering evidence and trusting that lies could not hold forever. Justice had arrived not with fire, but with clarity. Walter came in from the garden carrying a basket of peppers and set it down beside me. He kissed the top of my head and said the soil was ready for winter rye. I folded Clara's letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Mason burst in moments later with Daniel close behind his shoes, muddy, his cheeks flushed. He clambered into my lap, and the warmth of his small body against mine felt like a promise. Looking around that table, I knew the house was more than property. It was a vessel of memory, of laughter, of endurance. It had held betrayal, but now it held peace. The walls seemed to hum with life again, not from what was taken, but from what had been reclaimed. Revenge, I realized, had not been about rage. It had been about truth, about refusing to be erased, about standing firm until the ground shifted back beneath my feet. Peace was not handed to me. I had built it piece by piece, alongside those who chose love over manipulation. If you have ever been disrespected or erased, remember this. Truth and justice may be delayed, but they are never lost.